Hello everybody, welcome back. The second of our videos on homelessness, thinking about homelessness. I want to zoom in on the possible causes of homelessness, well, if we can. A nice starting place is to think about sociology and how sociological ideas may help us to understand homelessness. So my first task for you guys is a global social issue. The trends are quite gloomy. Most Western states have seen rising homelessness statistics over the past decades. I was looking at numbers, for example, from the early 2000s, and the trend, generally speaking, was upwards, with only a few exceptions. Which sociological concepts might help us to analyze this modern, contemporary phenomenon of homelessness? So what concepts from our sociology, and also what thinkers, what theories, what thinkers come to mind? So grab a pencil to chew, natter with your partner. What can you think of that might inform us here? I think there's a whole bunch of theories which are really, really rich and very useful for us to draw on if we wanted to. There's potential for original research here if you want to get intellectual and sociological about homelessness. A nice starting place, actually the nice starting places are the starting places of sociology. I immediately thought of Marxist approaches. Could we look at conflict in society models? Homeless people, are quite literally the people that are not winning from capitalism, they're capitalism's losers, so to say. So we could have conflict ideas, understanding, human relations and so on. That could be an interesting starting point, Marxist or neo-Marxist. Again, going back to old sociology, going back to the 19th century, Durkheim's ideas might be interesting, looking at it from the perspective of deviance. And then you've got the labeling theory, social interactionism and so on. This can also teach us a lot about how people have identities created. The idea of linking the private to the public, one of the main things that sociology does, that's obviously something that can be quite fruitful, thinking about homelessness. In a minute, we're going to be considering the causes, how much of a cause is public, how much of a cause is individual and private. So again, going back to classic ideas, the sociological imagination of Wright Mills, for example. Economic sociology can help us understand it. The trend I mentioned about increases in the last decades could be linked to neoliberalism, could be linked to changes in the workplace. Certainly plausible, isn't it? You've got perspectives thinking about risk, Ulrich Beck's risk society. More recently, we've zoomed in on the idea of precariousness, the gig economy, changes to the workplace. We've got social cohesion theory, how does a community stick together? What makes a strong binding society? You may say our societies today are weaker than they were, say, a generation or two ago. So the erosion of community values, but those theories are out there. Then you've got ideas from urban sociology, looking at the architecture of our cities. Do our cities create spaces for different kinds of citizens? How much is our architecture, our city planning causing homelessness? And then you've got so many different possibilities. Then you've got this rich literature on institutions, the sociology of institutions. I was thinking of Goffman's idea of the total institution. Many of my homeless residents who I worked with actually had experiences of total institutions. Then you've got Foucault's ideas about institutions in society. So there's really a rich set of possibilities by thinking sociologically about homelessness if you want to. Let's think in concrete terms about the causes of homelessness. I invite you to natter with your partner. Have you work or personal experiences of knowing someone who became homeless? Did you work with somebody who was homeless? Or did you have a friend who became homeless? How did it occur? What caused the homelessness? Pause here, natter with your partner. What did you come up with? It's quite interesting, of course, individual cases are only one biography, in no means representative, in a scholarly sense. On the other hand, I really do believe in personal accounts and the value of personal accounts. I learned a lot about homelessness hearing the stories of the people who I worked with. So hold on to those personal experiences which you have. I want to be a little bit provocative to get you thinking. So I thought I'd make a statement and then you can think about it with your partner and tell me whether you agree or disagree with this statement. My statement is, homelessness is not an individual problem, but rather it's a societal problem. Individuals are made homeless because of society's structures and society's institutions. What do you think about that? So it's a statement I'm offering you. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Discuss matter with your partner. What do you think? What do you think? How do you find it? It's certainly interesting to think about the role of structure, the role of institutions. Homelessness, yes, it's triggered by events in individual biographies. Typically, it follows a crisis in somebody's life. But it takes place in a social context. It takes place in a societal context. It's something that's happening in our society, in our communities. Society's institutions, I could list some of them here, schooling, healthcare, social welfare, social work. These institutions may shape the experiences of a homeless person. It may play a role in somebody becoming homeless. And also, society's institutions in a broader sense are important here. For example, marriage, the role of marriage in society, the stability of relationships, the security of our employment contracts. So all of these, less formal social institutions also changing, maybe shaping trends in homelessness. In the 1960s, social workers, sociologists rediscovered poverty. There'd been a period of quietness in poverty research. We picked it up again, though, in the 1960s from that point onwards. And again, for me, as a Brit, a key moment was a television play. A television program directed by a young filmmaker, Ken Loach. And it was called Kathy Come Home. And it's shot in a very realist style. It really is shot just like a documentary. You might think it was. It was broadcast on TV in 1966. Back at that time, homelessness was considered something that happened really to very other people, people on the margins of society. In Loach's film, we see it happen almost as if by chance to a very normal, everyday family. Loach, of course, the most wonderfully political of British filmmakers, and it really is a wonderful work. You will find it on YouTube, actually, if you want to watch it on its entirety on YouTube. And the DVD itself comes with a fascinating director's commentary. The film was enormously influential. When it was first shown in 1966, it was viewed by something like 12 million people. So something like 1 in 4 of the population watched this on TV. People were talking about it the next day. Homelessness charities were founded around that time. So there really was a kind of public discourse for the first time. And we were first beginning to learn how our social institutions can be responsible for the problem of homelessness. An obvious example of this is housing and housing policy. Each state, each nation has a different housing policy. The amount of housing stock, the amount of social housing stock, it varies from place to place. Kathy Come Home, the film ends with some info titles. One of them states that post-war West Germany had built twice as many social housing homes as Britain had. So there's disparities, there's an unequal amount of social housing from country to country. Moreover, the eligibility requirements for social housing, it varies from state to state. In Britain, for example, you'll be given social housing only if you're homeless and in some sense vulnerable. Okay, so we have criteria in the UK. The vulnerable get social housing provided, the non-vulnerable don't. They only get advice services, they only get hostel provision. So again, you'll see different patterns in homelessness based on such homelessness and housing policies. Housing benefit eligibility, that varies as well as the rules for those who intentionally made themselves homeless. I always found that a very, very problematic concept. It's kind of in our housing law, we don't give homes to people who intentionally made themselves homeless. But what on earth does it mean to say that somebody intentionally made themselves homeless? And in a weird sense, if you think about it, that can actually never happen anyway. So real complexity in the legal basis, complexity in the policy of your particular country. Homelessness and the welfare state. In a more general sense, are homeless people good welfare state customers? Do homeless people interact with the welfare state much? Think about it. Together with your partner, make a list of how homeless people might have used the welfare state's services. Which services they're going to be accessing during their lives. And it really is okay to take a life course approach. You might even want to start with this fantasy homeless person's birth, you know, and move from that point onwards. Pause now and think about that question. What did you come up with? What did you think of? In a sense, this is something that I really noted in my work. It was really quite clear to me. My clients, homeless people, they had a lot of contact with the welfare state. In their childhood, for example, they might have had contact with social services. They might have had a social worker. Many of them knew the care system. So it really started in their early years. Many of my clients, they had difficulties at school. Maybe even they had behavioral difficulties, emotional behavioral difficulties at school. Maybe they saw a school social worker or a school psychiatrist. Their early adulthood was often shaped with difficulties entering the job market, so they would have had employment services there. Typically, they were using services for disabled people or services for people with mental health problems. You know, spelling psychiatry was part of many people's biographies. They were living off benefits, and often, as well as unemployment benefit, you'd have disability benefits. Of course, if you pick up a problem, say problem drinking or substance use, that would also increase your likelihood of being eligible for disability benefits. So in a brutal sense, you know, these poor people really are big welfare state users. They're people who really use more services from the welfare state than others might do. A different question, we're still kind of in this area of what causes homelessness. And it's a very frustrating question to answer. It's a really hard point to pin down. I want to, again, kind of avoid it, push it to one side for a minute and ask a slightly different question. Determinants of homelessness. Because the causes are complex, let's instead look at risk factors for homelessness, determinants of homelessness. With your partner in a small group, consider what's linked to homelessness, what's related to homelessness, what are the risk factors, what are possible determinants. As an example, if you do very, very badly at school, that statistically increases the chance that you may end up in the homeless population. There really is a correlation between leaving school with no qualifications and being homeless later in life. Think about other areas, other risk factors, other areas where there may be a statistical risk between this characteristic and later on being homeless. Actually, it's a heartbreaking list to make because the risk factors list, you know, it's long and it's quite disturbing to look at these risk factors. Broadly speaking, you know, we can generalize. Homeless people have had some of the most difficult, some of the most negative life experiences. Speaking with my clients, I was often aware of high levels of trauma in their lives. Trauma going back to early childhood, but also traumatic experiences in the more recent adult life. You know, there's almost a commonality for all of the homeless people I had contact with. Problem substance use, maybe problem drinking or problem illicit substance use. Mental illness was part of many of my clients' biographies. Often dual diagnosis. I don't know if you guys know this term, dual diagnosis. Dual diagnosis is when I have a mental health problem and a substance use problem as well. Disability, bereavement, loss, grieving, mourning. Many of my clients had very, very difficult experiences of loss which they weren't prepared for, loss which they coped with only with great difficulty. I've mentioned the schooling point. Domestic violence obviously is part of a great many people's biographies, not just female clients, but also some male clients. And of course, experiencing parental domestic violence, also a gloomy commonality. Experiencing relationship breakdown themselves. Other points really are a bit harder to explain. Migration seems linked to homelessness, or simply being a member of an ethnic minority slightly increases the statistical likelihood. Having spent time having spent time in care as a child, in other words, in a children's home or in the care system, maybe moving from foster family to foster family. And of course, that brings us back to our first point, the whole point of trauma in childhood. So having studied this statistically, you know, we can pin it down. There's certainly risk factors. In no way do these risk factors invariably lead to homelessness, not at all. You may experience a number of these risk factors and never be homeless in your life. But if you look at the homeless population, many of these points seem to apply. Oh, sorry, I've missed one at the bottom there. Experience institutional care or a life phase as an adult. Let's move on. Summarizing these points then, you know, it's hard to say what causes homelessness in a kind of one-to-one sense. There's no one thing that will always cause homelessness, but we can certainly look at factors, and the factors we've just mentioned are individual factors, but we started off looking at the social context, the institutional context, things like housing policy. And this is summarized in the literature. Fitzpatrick talks about this as being the new orthodoxy. In a sense, the discourse has moved away from this question of structural versus individual, the question that I posed at the beginning of this talk. Instead, we look at these as being in a kind of complex interaction with one another. The individual agency, the sociological jargon, you know, the autonomous individual making decisions, having experiences, but also the structural, the institutions coming together in a complex way. The individual difficulties occur in conditions which are shaped by structural factors. So, for example, you know, those mental health problems that lead a person to psychiatry, when they're discharged from that psychiatric setting, in some countries, you know, they'll be looked after, there'll be really high quality supported accommodation. In other places, there may not be. So this weird interaction leads to somebody having a biography they wouldn't necessarily have had elsewhere. But again, it's complex, and what you can't do is predict what's going to happen. So it's, in many ways, it's really unsatisfying, doubly so, in the sense of we can't really predict, you know, we've got determinants, but we haven't really got causes in the real sense. And it's also unsatisfying because we don't really have a kind of conceptual clarity here. You know, there's not neat theories here. It's all a bit muddy and a bit confused. Again, we're social workers. If we wanted to have clarity and wonderful natural science style theories, you'd have entered medicine or some other area, wouldn't you? In a sense, we're social workers. We weren't expecting clarity anyway. I'm going to close this video now. I invite you to listen to a really fascinating podcast, which I've played to my students over years now, actually. There's a lovely interview on the Guardian website, something like 10 years old, an interview with a guy called Dennis Ben. He was a homeless person, and after recovering from homelessness, he got a job working with the homeless. In the podcast, he talks about his experiences. It's really nice listening. Listen to it. Think about the causes for homelessness that Dennis gives. He cites the ones which were the case in his biography. You can think about that. How do you find it hearing his personal narrative of what had happened to him? How do you find it listening to it, you know, from his mouth, from the horse's mouth, so to say? And the project itself has got a lovely concept. The idea is that a former homeless person, an ex-homeless person, helps the homeless. How do you find the project concept? There you are. Put on those questions, and I hope you enjoy that podcast. Thanks for listening this time. Last video coming up.